With Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe set to resign, the future of Japan's relations with countries in the region is suddenly an open question. During his tenure, Abe sought to build an alliance with the United States, India and Australia, primarily with the aim of countering China's influence. I'll be speaking to an expert about what the future of those ties is. But first, here's more on the strategic direction Abe gave Japan.
Shinzo Abe steered Japan's defense strategy in a radical new direction. He pledged to revise Japan's pacifist post-World War II constitution to counter changing security threats in the region. In his first speech to the nation, he said the security of Japan is not someone else's problem. It is a crisis that exists right there and now. Those words set the tone for Japan's defense over his years as prime minister, as Abe sought to ward off a newly assertive China, making incursions into Japanese waters and expanding its territorial claims in the South China Sea. North Korea has also posed a nuclear-armed menace with frequent missile tests. To demonstrate his muscular stance, Abe loosened a ban on arms exports. And in 2015, his party pushed through controversial legislation for so-called collective self-defense, allowing Japanese troops to engage in overseas combat with allied forces. The law drew strong opposition domestically, and a later push to revise the pacifist constitution failed. Abe's military reforms and containment diplomacy have upset China, its largest trading partner. Allies like U.S. President Donald Trump have confronted China with sanctions. But Abe's had to find the balance between competing and cooperating with China, despite his radical security ambitions, a needle his successor will likely also have to thread.
So what happens next? Simon Denyer is the Washington Post bureau chief for Japan and the Koreas, and he joins me now from Tokyo. Simon, I'd like to look at Japan's relations with China first. Where do you see them headed after Shinzo Abe steps down?
Well, there have been quite a lot of ups and downs in the relationship between Japan and China. They started off really badly under Abe's tenure. He's worked quite hard to improve them, actually, in the last few years. So, it's going to be very interesting to see whether China tries to exploit this and push its territorial claims to the Senkaku Islands. It's already threatening to do that. It's been more active around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, as China calls them. So we may see China, as it's done with India, seeing an opportunity to push its territorial claims in the absence of Abe and while this leadership transition is going on. That's something to keep an eye on.
There was some talk of a so-called new era in ties between Japan and China, and it was mostly down to Shinzo Abe. He, in fact, visited China as well to try and smoothen things over. Do you think that is a thing of the past now?
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a thing of the past. I think that whoever comes in after Abe is likely to continue to try to do this. But, Japan-China relations, they're never going to be best of friends. They do have wartime issues between them. Japan is an ally of America. China and the United States are, clearly not seeing eye to eye, far from it. So Japan's kind of caught in the middle. Abe's done quite a good job, I think, of patching things up and not letting the China relationship deteriorate. But I don't think, we're ever talking about a golden era. We're talking about sort of both sides putting their differences aside and just getting on with things more than real friendship.
Japan was also considered an important partner for the United States, India and Australia in the so-called Indo-Pacific region. Do you see that cooperation, Simon, continuing?
And broadly speaking, yes, I do. I think that, Japan is very committed to being part of an alliance of democracies in Asia and beyond the Pacific region, as you say. It's going to be very interesting to see how the relationship with the United States develops, though. If President Trump does get another term in office, I think that Japan probably would have liked to have had someone like Shinzo Abe, who gets on very well with Trump as their prime minister, Trump hasn't really taken aim at Japan, but he's always kind of threatened to. So it could be quite rocky for Japan if you don't have Abe there and if Trump were to win another term. Obviously, if it's Biden and whoever succeeds Abe, I think relations between Japan and the US will be pretty smooth.
Lots of ifs and buts there, but plenty to watch out for. But thanks so much for this conversation. Simon Denier in Tokyo, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Now, there's a certainly tragic irony in the fact that the man who was elected to office 8 years ago primarily because of his economic policies will now leave the country, as he himself says, in one of the worst economic crises for decades.
7 years, 8 months. That's how long Shinzo Abe was in office, longer than any other prime minister in Japan. When he announced his resignation, citing health reasons, he focused on the crippling effects of the pandemic on the Japanese economy. This year's second quarter saw economic growth shrink by almost 28%. And how will things shape up without Abe? The markets reacted to the news of his resignation with pessimism. Initial reports saw the Nikkei index drop 2.1%. By close of trading, it was still 1.4% down. What's the mood on the streets of Tokyo? I'm surprised. He looked really tired, but I didn't think he would resign. I wish he could work harder and stay on in office a bit longer. I've been wanting him to resign for a long time. Shinzo Abe is a controversial figure in Japan, partly because of his emphasis on his public image. In 2012, he introduced his ambitious economic programme, naming it unabashedly after himself. With Abenomics, I will increase jobs and incomes and revitalise the countryside. Abenomics was about easing monetary policy. The Japanese central bank cranked up the money press, flooding the market with fresh new notes. There were also credit-financed economic stimulus packages. Initially, the programme did increase confidence, both in the economy and among the Japanese population. But the risks of Abenomics soon became clear. The programme over-leveraged the economy to the point of sovereign bankruptcy and led to a loss of confidence on capital markets. The already struggling Japanese economy has been hit hard by the coronavirus. With Abe out of the picture, it's up to someone else to pull Japan out of the crisis.
Now, earlier I spoke to Professor Jeff Kingston, Director of Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan in Tokyo. And referring to Shinzo Abe's economic strategy, I asked him what worked well and what didn't.
Well, the list of what did work well, I think, is relatively short. I think he was good in terms of promoting free trade. He cut a deal with the EU. He also rescued the TPP. But on what didn't work, he never delivered on structural reforms, which were the third era of Abenomics, which are supposed to improve productivity. He never delivered on womenomics. He said he was going to help women shine, but that hasn't happened. There has been an expansion of women's employment, but it's been in poorly paid, dead-end careers in non-regular employment. So that hasn't really worked out either. Generally speaking, households in all sorts of polls say they're not feeling the love. They didn't feel the trickle down. A lot of people dismiss Abenomics as welfare for the wealthy. Corporations have done well. Hedge fund managers have done well, but the average person doesn't see much increase at all in their pay packet, and so the general sense of well-being has not improved.
All right. And how big a role is or has the pandemic been playing in all this?
Well, Abenomics was pretty much dead in the water, at least 2-3 years ago. It really was fading. So it was already in trouble. And then last fall, he introduced an increase in the consumption tax, which is regressive. And that really sent consumption plummeting downward. And that's the real problem of the pandemic, is that people's income is shrinking. A lot of people are furloughed, they're losing their bonuses, whatever. So there's been shrinking consumption. And as people anticipate that the economic typhoon is going to be gathering force over the coming months. People are battening down the hatches, spending less, and that creates sort of a downward cycle. And so it doesn't look too bright. So problem for Abe is, what's his legacy? Abenomics certainly was a failure. He was hoping that the Olympics might be a feel-good send-off, but that doesn't look very likely. And so his pandemic response has generally drawn heavy criticism from the public. They don't think he's done very well. So he's tired out.
And that was Professor Jeff Kingston from Temple University in Tokyo talking to us earlier. Well, time to bring in Chelsea Delaney now, our financial market correspondent in Frankfurt. Chelsea, good to see you. Tell me, what is the financial world saying about Shinzo Abe's resignation?
It has been a bit of a shock to the markets, and we've definitely seen that reflected in both the Japanese stock market and also the currency markets. Obviously, there had been reports that Shinzo Abe had been in and out of the hospital the past couple of weeks, but nobody really saw this coming today. And of course, this does come at a terrible time for Japan when their economy is facing a record contraction. Shinzo Abe, obviously a controversial figure, but he has been seen as really a stable hand over the past several years. So the loss of that in this really dire economic situation is a bit of a blow. But obviously, the big question now is what's going to happen with Abenomics.
And exactly, and with 20 seconds to go, you have the chance to tell us who could be the possible successor of Shinzo Abe.
There are a lot of names on the potential successor list. It likely is going to be somebody from his party, the Liberal Democrats. And that likely will also mean that Abenomics is not gone. Maybe it will have a new name, but this policy of aggressive stimulus, of aggressive monetary policy is likely going to stay in place with the economy in this shape.
All right, Chelsea Delaney in Frankfurt. Thank you.